This episode is brought to you by the continuing education courses in the Neurodiversity University. From individual study at home access to a district-wide program for all your educators, the courses from Emily Kircher-Morris can be used to fulfill CE requirements. Go to neurodiversity.university or click the link in the show notes for more information.
So when I started thinking about writing for kids, I knew I wanted to write middle grade because I had written some books for adults previously. After being in that environment for enough time, I really decided that, like, knowing those kids the way I do, I wanted to write books for them. But I specifically wanted to write books with neurodivergent characters because, you know, that's also the ethos that I live in.
Diving into a good book can open up whole new worlds for kids, especially when they see themselves in the stories they read. What's it like to write these stories while also being an educator? How should we talk to kids about neurodivergence in a way that empowers and supports them? Brad Wright, a neurodivergent educator and author of the Infinity Blast book series, is here to unpack these topics with us, sharing insights on the power of representation in children's literature and its ties to social and emotional learning. That's all coming up on episode 221. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity?
You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
You've heard us talking about the Neurodiversity University Educator Hub, and now we're getting ready to launch the Therapist Hub as our next step to providing training and professional development to professionals who support neurodivergent people. The Therapist Hub will offer monthly continuing education workshops that are specifically curated for professionals who want to learn more about using neurodiversity-affirming practices. And this is all approved by the NBCC Credentialing Board for Mental Health Clinicians, so you can apply this continuing education toward your license. So get on the list and we'll let you know when it opens. Just click the link in the show notes. Okay, my conversation with Brad Wright is coming right up.
Previously on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
We describe these autistic behaviors from the outside, what we see these kids doing when they struggle. And we describe that as the definition of autism, that there's these deficits in social ability because we want them to be more social. And there's these deficits in their restrictive repetitive behaviors because we want them to be more flexible. And these are grievances. It's not what autism feels like on the inside. And this is also true in the anxiety community. You're avoiding this. We need you to go to school. We need you to eat these foods because it's difficult on a caregiver or it's difficult on the support people. And that can be a big motivation for people to want to change. But we want people who are entering into therapy to think about what their own goals are and not just be responding to the grievances of their community.
That's episode 199. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
Brad Wright is with me today. Brad is a neurodivergent educator and administrator, and he is also the author of the Infinity Blast series of middle grade books featuring neurodivergent characters. So, Brad, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to be on the podcast. It's one of my favorite podcasts, so it's kind of like a dream come true for me.
That's awesome. Well, I'm really happy to have you here, and I love speaking to authors, especially those who have been educators, because I really think there's so much about working with students in a school setting that really gives us some insight into a child's world. And reading is such an influential part of their lives in so many ways. So I would love to start off our conversation with you sharing just a bit about your work as an educator and how it influenced your decision to write fiction for young people.
Sure, yeah. Well, I would begin by saying that I took a very circuitous route to becoming a teacher. It was never a plan I had for myself. I personally had a terrible experience as a young person in school.
Right. Yeah.
I never thought of like being a teacher as a career goal, really. And actually, my first career was I was a professional ballet dancer, which is pretty weird.
It's awesome. It's unusual. Like you don't hear many people who have that career, but that's very cool.
And I did that for a little while, then went back to school and got a bachelor's degree in English literature and a master's in anthropology, and was thinking about doing further graduate study and becoming possibly a college professor. That was the only thing I ever thought of when I thought of teaching. But instead of that, I took a weird right turn and became an IT person working in Silicon Valley and doing systems administration and network administration, just by a weird chance. Like I fell into that. But after doing that for a while, I was feeling like I didn't love that rat race. I didn't love the sort of ethos of the Silicon Valley startup. And I just one day saw an advertisement for a job at a school, running the network and systems for the school. And I thought, well, that sounds interesting. I'll apply. And I ended up getting hired. And immediately, as soon as I was in a school, I realized that this is where I was meant to be. I had never really appreciated teachers until I worked alongside them, and I realized what outstanding people teachers are, like how much of themselves they sort of give to their job. I think a lot of people don't understand that who have never done it, but it's a job that requires not just your work, but like your soul in a way. Mm-hmm. And so the longer I worked in that school setting, the more I kind of got drawn into education, and I started coaching, and I started volunteering to do like outdoor education trips, and I started helping out with the technology classes, and little by little I got drawn into teaching. And at the school I work at now in Los Angeles, I'm an advisor, so I'm a 7th grade advisor. I teach a 5th grade, we call it Design Code Make, it's our technology class. I teach programming electives, and I coach our robotics team. And so I do all kinds of teacher adjacent things. And I still have, every time I step into a classroom, I still have a huge amount of fear that I'm not a real teacher, because I've never been formally educated in teaching. But I feel like I've been in schools for almost 20 years now, and I watch what other teachers do, and I learn from them. I listen to them. I know all of the education buzzwords. But I think that coming to it as an outsider, it gives me a different take on the profession. And also as a neurodivergent person, I think that I have an outlook when I'm in the classroom that is different from what a lot of teachers have. And I'm always provided accommodations for students from the very beginning of my teaching experience, just naturally, because it's the kind of thing that I would have wanted as a kid. And so when I see a kid struggling who has, issues with executive functioning or emotional regulation or any of those things that are common for neurodivergent people, like I feel like I respond naturally in a way. And I've developed sort of over time, I've developed systems for accommodating kids. So to come back to your actual question, like how did that influence my decision to write books for kids? I just love middle school students, and that's like mostly the kids that I've worked with are middle school students from 5th to 8th grade. And I know it's unusual. Like you have to be a special kind of person to teach middle schoolers. Everybody says it. It's true. It's like, it's just not everybody's cup of tea, but I love those kids. And so when I started thinking about writing for kids, I knew I wanted to write middle grade, because I had written some books for adults previously. After being in that environment for enough time, I really decided that, like, knowing those kids the way I do, I wanted to write books for them. But I specifically wanted to write books with neurodivergent characters, because, that's also the ethos that I live in. My whole family is like a big, happy neurodivergent family. Right. So it was partially because I was having trouble finding books that my son wanted to read. He loves reading, but a lot of the books that are out there on the market for boys and that have to do with like STEM, he's a real like science, technology, engineering kind of kid. So he likes sci-fi, and he likes any book that has to do with like computers and video games and stuff like that. But a lot of those books, they have a lot of like gross out humor and like slapstick violence that he did not appreciate. So when I decided to write a book, I really thought about a book that he would like, but also a book that, you know, the other kids I teach who are like him, who are neurodivergent and who are into those sorts of subjects would also enjoy. And I think a lot of times publishers think that, well, we need to put these things in books that we know that boys like. But I wanted to write books that, you know, the gentler kids would also enjoy, and the kids who are more sensitive would also enjoy, and that not just boys, but also girls and everything in between would enjoy. So, so that's really what drew me to writing for kids. And I think that my perspective as a teacher and like my sort of deep knowledge of the psychology of the kids in that age range really helped when I went about trying to create the characters and the story that I ended up writing.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's true, you know, especially when you grow up neurodivergent and you have those experiences in schools, it influences your work when you become an educator. But then also you can pull from all of those things to create these worlds. I think also one of the pieces that I think is important to address, because adults in general don't always know how to approach this topic with kids, but there's so much stigma about neurodivergence and about labels that are associated with it. And while we do have a lot more acceptance in today's world than we did in the past, people are always asking, like, when should they talk to kids about being neurodivergent and how should they have those conversations? What are your thoughts about the best ways to approach those conversations?
So I think that it starts with the adults being educated. I think it's really important because I've actually seen teachers and other adults try to talk to kids about neurodiversity and about neurodivergence and say some wrong things sometimes. And I always sort of like, you know, clench my jaw and try to hold back from actuallying people because, you know, it's so stereotypical to actually people.
Well, we appreciate accuracy, though. We just want to help people be accurate.
Yeah, but the number one thing that I would recommend to almost anybody who was a teacher or just a parent and wanted to talk to kids about neurodiversity would be to read Neurotribes by Steve Silberman. It's like, it's the book that was most formative for me when I started my neurodivergent journey as an adult, which really, like, for a lot of parents, it starts when their kids are diagnosed. I'm an old person, so like when I was a kid, those diagnoses didn't exist. The knowledge didn't exist. So, and that was really the very first book I picked up. It happened to have just come out in paperback, I think. I heard something about it on NPR. I think maybe Steve Silverman was on NPR on Terry Gross's show. And reading that book really just opened a whole world of knowledge to me. And like, not just that book, but everything I've read since that, like, I read because I read that book. So I think that being educated and, of course, listening to podcasts is a great way to do that, too. I've actually recommended some of your podcasts to colleagues. Just the other day, we were talking about a student who is a slow processor, and I said, oh, you should listen to this one podcast.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, the field of sort of neurodiversity studies is changing so fast. It's like, you know, we're learning new things every day. So I think it's really important for adults to be educated before they try to talk to kids. And then the other thing I would say is talk to them. Don't withhold information. I've known some parents who felt like they didn't want their kid to have a label, like that they didn't want to tell their kid they were autistic or tell their kid they were ADHD because they felt like it would change the way they thought about themselves. But to me, kids know it in their bones that they're different. If you don't tell them, if you don't give them a name for that, then they come up with their own theories and they come up with their own ways of thinking about it. And it can really affect their self-esteem. And I think that it can affect their self-esteem positively if they have a name for what they are. And then they can go do their research about that and they can find out more. Other than that, I think it needs to be natural. Kids, in my experience, having worked in schools for a long time, are really allergic to being lectured by adults, especially about something like disability or neurodiversity. They see it as not a genuine way of communicating. So I think the more that teachers can be educated and the more that they can sort of naturally weave it into their teaching practice, the better. Like an example would be, if you have a kid in your class who's having a strong emotional reaction, maybe is on the edge of a meltdown, and the other kids are noticing that, obviously, because they do, you can just kind of offhand say, oh, well, Caitlin is autistic, so she has strong emotional reactions. Just give her a minute to calm down and then check in with her and then just go on about your business. And when you present it to children in that way, they see it as something completely natural, just the way another person's brain works. And it's better for them than to, sit down for reading time with the book about Johnny is autistic. And I think that both of those approaches are great, but I think that the more naturally it can be woven into the teaching practice, the better, because that's really, to me, how you normalize things and how children learn about things the best.
Mm-hmm.
Neurodivergent kids need space where they can be themselves, especially in a school environment. And the way we do that at my school is we have affinity groups. And I actually started the Neurodivergent Student Affinity Group and sort of serve as their mentor when we meet. And it's really an amazing experience when you see these kids who have to mask all day at school. And my school is kind of extraordinary in that there's a lot of acceptance and a lot of education about neurodiversity, but still the kids mask. They try really, really hard to be able to keep everything together all day at school. And then when they come into affinity group, and they can kind of drop that mask and just talk about their own experience, what it's like to be in school, what it's like to have to hold it together and to sort of hide their true selves. It's like just an amazing experience to see that. And so I think that giving kids that kind of space where they can talk to each other, not just have adults talking at them about neurodiversity, but to let them actually talk about their experience with each other is an incredibly powerful thing that you can do for them.
Yeah, I think that that's really so valuable, and to just kind of normalize that for kids, and not just at home where they can unmask, but in these other more public places, but then, to help focus on self-advocacy or just, self-knowledge, just being able to understand oneself.
Hey there, if you're an educator looking to create a more inclusive classroom, you should check out the courses at Neurodiversity University. The courses are all led by Emily Kircher-Morris, and they're packed with videos, handouts, and quizzes to help you better educate neurodivergent students, and students of all neurotypes, really. You can choose from a number of modules dealing with topics like learning how to support dyslexic students, nurturing gifted or twice exceptional kids, or helping autistic and ADHD learners thrive. There's even a course on using AI and fan communities to build coping strategies. These courses are great for professional development or to fulfill your continuing ed requirements. And parents, you can use them to better understand how teachers are accommodating your kids' needs and get some ideas to advocate from a stronger position. The university is part of the Neurodiversity Alliance, just like our podcast. So now you know, all that's left to do is head to the link in the description and check it all out. Let's make classrooms work better for every kind of learner.
I think another piece of this has to do with representation, because when we are able to see ourselves in media, whether that's through the books that we read or movies or shows that we watch or whatever, that experience not only validates our own lived experiences, but really also helps to offer opportunities for developing empathy and perspective taking for those whose lives are different from our own. So I'm curious if you can share any of your observations about that evolution of neurodivergent characters in children's literature, and what role you feel like that plays in the lives of young people.
I think that you can see neurodivergent characters going all the way back. And, like we were discussing before, those words and those diagnoses didn't exist in the 17th and 18th century, but the people did.
Right.
And I think even going back to like Jane Austen, one of my favorite authors, one of my favorite books, Pride and Prejudice, like if Elizabeth Bennet is not neurodivergent, I don't know who is, right? Or like Sherlock Holmes is another great example. You know, that's just a very clearly portrayed autistic character. So I think that we don't have to necessarily state it on the page to get that, you know, that benefit that you were talking about of representation. And but I do think that recently, when I first started thinking about writing neurodivergent characters in my books, I did a lot of reading because that's the way my brain works. I'm a researcher. And I read pretty much everything that was out there, every book that I could find that was middle grade or young adult that featured, you know, a character who was autistic or ADHD or dyslexic or any of the many other types of neurodivergence. And what I found back then, which was 10 years ago, 12 years ago, was that there was very little representation. And when there was, it was often stereotypical. It was often written by authors who were not neurodivergent themselves, who were looking at it from the outside and almost writing, you know, sort of walking portrayal of the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria, right? So, and that was a little dispiriting. But then I think since then, there's been a real explosion of acceptance in publishing and a belief that those characters really need to be represented genuinely on the page. So there's just so many great books. While there are so many great books, there still needs to be more. I was just researching this the other day, and I think it was only about 3.5% of middle grade books published in the last few years had a character with a disability. Of those, very few of them were neurodivergent characters. So while there are a lot of great books now, I think that we need to keep making more so that, you know, there's a famous saying that if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Everybody is like incredibly different. Every neurodivergent person is a super unique collection of different traits that, you know, make them who they are. So I think we need to see all of those characters on the page, all of those different kinds of neurodivergent traits so that everybody can see themselves represented. In education, we talk about mirror books and we talk about window books. And so a mirror book would be a book for a neurodivergent kid that has a neurodivergent character. But I think that it's also important to think of them as window books for kids who are neurotypical and who are reading about these characters. And to me, when I write, I want my characters... I don't think I'm capable of writing a neurotypical character, actually. So, but I want them to appear genuine, but I want the book to not be about the fact that they're neurodivergent. I want it to be about the story that the book is telling. And I want the character to happen to be a strong visual thinker or forget about things if they're out of sight, or, you know, maybe be a slow processor or a fast processor, or have like super hyper focus and sort of monotropic qualities. Like all of these things that are not DSM criteria, but that are traits that a lot of neurodivergent people share. I want to portray those so that people get a more nuanced appreciation of what it means to, you know, have a different kind of brain.
How do you address that in your books? Like, do you bring up the fact that these characters have those particular labels, or do you kind of leave it more for inferencing just based on those character traits?
When I wrote the very first Infinity Blast book, I sent it into my editor and she read it and she said, I think that we need to state somewhere in the book that this character is autistic and this character has ADHD. And I, you know, maybe I'm a bit naive, but it seemed so obvious to me that I didn't feel like I needed to actually put it on the page. But then I thought about it and I ended up agreeing with her. And so I added a scene where the one character is complaining about something and saying that it's so ADHD, and then the other character talks about being autistic and how that's different. And So I kind of wove it naturally into the story just as an aside or kind of offhand comment, just so that it would be in there, it would be on the page.
Yeah.
But I've also had editors, I've written characters that to me like had very, very obvious neurodivergent traits. There was a book I wrote recently that was, it's like for a 5th grade reading level. And the editor was actually questioning me about it because she didn't see that list of DSM criteria in this character that we talked about earlier. And she was wondering, well, is this character really autistic enough? And to me, like, that's part of the education process. That's part of the process of teaching people that there's more to it than, those stereotypical representations they're used to from media and from film and TV and books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, part of that is if we don't approach conversations, whatever those conversations might be, and show some of those, I don't want to say less common, but less recognized profiles that we see in neurodivergent people, then we're not doing anything to break down the stereotypes.
Right.
And that's so important because that's what prevents people from getting the supports that they need is that, like, well, you can't really be autistic or you're not ADHD. How do you, you can't really have dyslexia. And I think that is a barrier for people getting the supports that they need.
Right. And to me also, like, I have a real strong issue with the DSM diagnoses and with the, with all of those D words they use in those diagnoses, like, deficit and disorder. And I don't only have an issue because of those words, which is to me that those are harmful words. I think that the way we talk about kids is the way they see themselves. So if you use the word disorder and deficit, then they're going to see themselves as a person with deficits and disorders. For one thing, we need to change all of the names of those diagnoses. But also, I think that the more we learn about neurodivergence, the more we learn that those are maybe presentations that are common, but they don't describe the full breadth of a person. Just recently, we've seen it with autism and ADHD. There's like more of a knowledge that those are maybe two sides of the same type of brain in a way. And also that the other things like dyslexia and face blindness and OCD and anxiety are all, I hate the word comorbid, but comorbid with other forms of neurodivergence. That it's almost like saying this person's autistic and this person is OCD is almost not useful at all. It's like, I think that we need to talk more about these are the traits that you have. These are the things that we can do to help you get by in the world, given that you have that trait. A great example is that my wife and my son both, I'm going to absolutely mispronounce this word, but they have a condition called prosopagnosia, I think is the... Yeah. So did I say it right?
Yeah, we did an episode on it a while ago. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I haven't listened to that one. I'll have to. That basically means they're face blind. They don't recognize people by seeing their face. So, my son goes to school and one of his friends got a haircut or is wearing like a different clothing than they normally wear. He doesn't recognize them. And in a lot of ways, that's more disabling than other traits that he might have. It's like one of the most disabling things, but it's one that no psychologist has ever asked him about. It's something that he's never been diagnosed with or given any accommodations for. So, like, I think that when you focus on these like really narrow diagnoses, you actually lose those kinds of things. To me, that the whole system needs to be overhauled.
Yeah, it's limiting as far as trying to get those supports. We're actually recording this episode the day after the eclipse. We are a family of self-proclaimed space nerds. My husband, Dave, our producer, being the chief space nerd of the family. And so we actually took our kids out of school and we drove, because we're in St. Louis, we drove a few hours to the path of totality. But your series, Infinity Blast, is created for kids like mine who love all things space. So tell us a little bit more just about the book series in general. So for anyone who's going, gosh, I wonder if this sounds like something my kids would enjoy, what should they know?
We're a big space nerd family too. And it really, like, I find that my special interests oftentimes follow special interests that my son develops. And it comes from him. ever since he was like 4 or 5 years old. I think we saw a rocket launch one time, and like that was the thing that like cemented it for him.
Mm-hmm.
He's just been super into the history of sort of manned spaceflight and rockets and space shuttles. And so when I started thinking about writing a middle grade book, specifically writing a middle grade book that hopefully he would want to read, I knew I had to make it about space stuff. But I also knew it had to be science fiction, and I wanted to get some like aliens in there. So, and he loves to go to the Science Museum in Los Angeles, and we have the Endeavour space shuttle there, the actual space shuttle, that went to space like 147 times or something. And he would be able to tell me the exact number. And so we've been there probably 10 times to visit the space shuttle. And we were there one day, and they had a model of the new building that they're building just to house the space shuttle. And in that building, they moved it the other day. It's actually in position now. But in that new building, it's going to be sitting upright with the solid rocket boosters on it and the fuel tank. And it's going to be like on a launch pad and with a gantry tower. And it's going to look like it's ready to launch, basically, which is going to be super cool to see in person. But they had an architectural rendering of that, and when I saw it, it just clicked in my mind. What if some kids stole that space shuttle and launched it into orbit? That was where the genesis of the story came from. So the book is about some kids. Their parents are astrophysicists, and they capture this message from outer space and they managed to decode it. They're the first people to decode it. And it's a message from aliens saying, we're coming to Earth. We're peaceful. We just want to meet you and talk to you. Basically, they're anthropologists. They're alien anthropologists coming to Earth.
Okay.
But then the sort of regime that's in power, they have this space weapon they built, and they want to like use their space weapon to destroy these aliens that are coming to Earth. And the kids have to go on this sort of quest to prove that these aliens are innocent and that they shouldn't be destroyed. And they end up in the process having to, I don't want to give too much of the book away, but they end up having to steal a space shuttle. So.
No, that sounds wonderful. I know that my youngest, who's 8, almost 9, but he's the one who probably is the most into space. He had a special interest specifically about dwarf planets for quite a while, like very specific, and so I'm so excited for him to have the opportunity to see these and read.
He sounds like just the kid that I wrote the book for. So
that's awesome. I love that. Well, Brad, this has been such an awesome conversation, but this does bring us to our last question. So if you were talking to a neurodivergent child who is trying to figure out where they fit in this world, what would you tell them? Like, what is it that you would just really want them to hear?
Interesting question. I think that so many of us have special interests, and so many of us have special interests that are discouraged by sort of neurotypical spaces. I would say hold on to that, because that's really the thing that makes you unique. And I would say that a lot of times kids find themselves in very sort of circumscribed spaces, sort of circumscribed experiences. They might go to a small school, they might live in a small town, or they might just not have the opportunity to meet a lot of other people. But the older you get, the more your world will expand, and you can make choices to expand it in the ways that are meaningful. And I think that the thing that I would have liked to hear as a kid was that you will find your people as you get older. If you sort of stay true to who you are, and, the world forces us to mask, but be open to like dropping your mask for the right person. And you'll find the people who, that you're going to click with, and that will become your sort of chosen family. And so I think that it can be really hard as a kid to know that that's going to happen for you. But I think that if you remain open, that it will, and that's the way you really are going to, become a fully actualized person that can accept who you are, rather than falling into that trap of low self-esteem that the neurotypical world often like forces those kids into.
Brad Wright, author of the Infinity Blast book series, thanks so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you. It was a really great chatting with you. This is a good conversation.
Who are some of the neurodivergent characters in the book series you read when you were growing up? My favorite book series when I was growing up was Madeleine L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time, which shows a whole crew of neurodivergent kids trying to figure things out. There were 2 siblings in the Murray family who were relatively neuronormative, which was as confusing for Meg and Charles Wallace as my peers were for me at school. I read and reread those books over and over because I loved seeing Meg, in all of her awkward nerdiness, be successful, not despite it, but because of it. I could relate. And in a world that sometimes felt really alone, I realized I wasn't. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
I thought of you, hoping that the ripples would make you notice me. And now you're here, sunlight on the ripples. Somehow you notice me.
Hey, thanks again to Brad Wright. We appreciate him joining us. Now, I am off to read that story about the space shuttle. Also, if you or anyone you know is an educator, or if you head up a continuing education effort in your school district, there is a link in the show notes to the Neurodiversity University. We're adding courses as often as we can, and there are many to choose from now to help you better understand students of all neurotypes. So check it out. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our office manager and social media director is Krista Brown. I am the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.
I thought of you, hoping that the ripples would make you notice me. And now you're here, sunlight on the ripples. Somehow you notice me.
This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.